This is Rob Gray from ASU and PerceptionAction.com. Today on the Perception and Action podcast, my interview with John Kiely, Senior Lecturer in Elite Performance from the University of Central Lancashire in the UK. Hi everyone, welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, my interview with John Kiely from UCLAN. John received his MSc in Strength and Conditioning from the University of Edinburgh. He has worked with athletes and coaches from a wide range of sports and is former head of S&C for UK Athletics. He currently coaches, instructs, and does research as part of the Institute for Coaching and Performance at UCLAN. On the surface, John might seem like an unusual guest for this podcast, given that he is a quote-unquote physiology S&C person, while my emphasis is on psychology. But I hope that you'll see through this interview that there's a lot more in common between these two areas than most people think. In the interview, we focus on John's work on the stress process and how it relates to training, periodization, and injury. We discuss how theories of stress have evolved from it being a purely physiological fight or flight response to it being a process that is heavily influenced by psychological and emotional factors. We also discuss how coaches should be designing supportive training environments that take into account an athlete's stress that occurs both on and off the field to maximize buy-in from the performer. Hope you enjoy!
Not 10 years ago, I was a child. I was a good boy and you let me go. Now I'm on a talk show.
So my guest today is John Kiely, Senior Lecturer in Elite Performance from the University of Central Lancashire. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me, John.
My pleasure, Rob.
So to get the ball rolling, can you tell us a little bit about your background and maybe how you got interested in coaching and sports science?
Yeah, well, I guess my background was a little back to front in the sense that I was, long before I ever did sports science, I started off as an athlete and as a coach in a number of sports, and I competed internationally in my own sport and went down the route of gym instructor. So I was really spending my life training by day, competing, working in the gym to make some money, doing some coaching to make some money, and really just living that athletic life. And I was so interested in it. I was so fascinated by it that I read a lot, and eventually I decided to go to the local university and study sports science, even though I'd never really considered myself university material before. And that was, in maybe my mid-20s. And since then, I've been lucky enough to work in quite a few roles in elite sport, working with elite teams or athletes, mostly as an S&C or a consultant sports scientist. And at this stage, I've been around the block a couple of times now, and I've worked with a number of world champions, Olympic medalists, international competition winning teams. So far, so good. But I still coach in my local boxing club every Friday night, and I'm still trying to, not get carried away with the big name stuff and stay grounded and stay true to my roots.
Well, that's great. And yeah, it seems like you have a really good group for mixing coaching and research there.
Yeah, so where we are, and I know you've interviewed Professor Dave Collins before, so Dave would be one of our group, and we're all research active. We all publish, but we all work with teams, practitioners. We all consult. So we're all out on the ground quite a lot. So hopefully we don't lose touch with what's going on in the real world.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. So the main topic we wanted to dive into today that you've been doing some writing about and research about is our view of stress and how it applies to kind of training and periodization. And so to kick it off, maybe this is a big question. So however much you want to do with this, can you talk a little bit about how the view of the stress process has changed? Everyone probably knows the cellier kind of classical stuff. But I think there's been a lot of changes in the way that we think about stress that's added a lot of twists to it. So maybe can you give us like a quick over of that kind of evolution of our thinking about stress?
I can definitely give you an overview. I don't know about quick. But,
okay, that's fine.
What I would say is that, so Cellier started his research in the 1930s, but his research was so, especially his early career research was so impactful that if we look in the sports science world and we look at our top peer-reviewed journals, people are still citing Cellier. There was a periodization article published in Sports Medicine last year, a review. And again, part of the support for conventional periodization theory is the work of Walter Cannon from Harvard, which was in the 1920s, and then Cellier's work. But again, Cellier's early work, his 1930s to 1950s work. So even though that's, a lifetime ago at this stage, the bones of 7 decades, we still recycle it, specifically within the periodization research. And it's still quoted as the foundations of the logic that goes into or that underpins periodization theory. So even though it's a very historical theory, we still cite it today in our cutting edge journals to justify why we think what we think. Now, in terms of the evolution of stress, I guess you have to go back and look at Cellier, and none of this is intended to detract from the work he did. It's probably instructive just to think about the technology that he was using. So Cellier effectively worked with rodents, and his stress experiments took the form broadly of being nasty to rats. So you get a rat and you overheat it for a prolonged period, or you put it up on the roof through a very cold winter, or you electrically shock it, you force it to run around forever, these type of things. And then the assessment was you sacrifice the rat and you weigh its adrenal glands, and you compare those to what you consider to be normal glands. And that's how that's the level of insight that he was using to try and deconstruct the role of the various hormones that he was interested in investigating at the time. So very, very primitive technology. Now, I guess one of the things that about rats is they tend not to have quite the social life that 21st century humans have. And so they tend not to be prone to a lot of the biopsychosocial pressures that humans are. Humans can sit alone in a room and think themselves into high levels of stress. Whereas, give a rat food, comfort, another rat to cuddle, and they're happy. They're not worried about their tax returns. Humans, very different kettle of fish. So I guess the next point to observe was that Cellier thought of stress as a very physical phenomena. A physical stress induced a physical response, physically mediated, resulted in physical adaptations. He pretty much, I won't say neglected, but vastly underestimated the role of the brain, cognition, emotion in regulating the stress response. And as Cellier's work progressed through the 40s, 50s, 60s, on the other side of the fence, psychologists were starting to evolve their own research in relation to stress, and psychologists' understanding of stress was very different. And from the early days, psychologists viewed stress as a mismatch between your perception of the resources that you have available to you to cope with a challenge and your perception of the nature of that challenge. So very much an above the neck phenomenon, whereas Cellier was very much a below the neck phenomenon. And over time, really in the 60s and certainly in the 70s, these two routes started to bang into each other effectively. And specifically, there was a group in Walter Reed Memorial run by Joseph V. Brady which was very novel in its time in that it was interdisciplinary in its staff. So it had physiologists working beside medical doctors, working beside psychologists. And one of their researchers, and specifically a guy called John Mason, did a number of investigations where he induced the physical stress but tried to remove the psychological negative associations of that physical stress, and found that you could remove the general adaptation syndrome, which was Selye's proposition as to how physical stress was countered. You could vastly reduce the effects of a physical insult purely by changing emotional context and the environment in which the stress was imposed. So, again, carrying out my long answer. So,
no, it's great. That's great.
And if you read the history of this, there was kind of a transitional event in 1975, but it's hard to get a good handle on exactly what happened. But there was a conference. Selye presented. John Mason presented. And Selye presented his work, which was, again, very much stress is a physical insult countered in a physical way with a physical response. And Mason's work was, hey, this is a really biopsychosocial phenomenon here. And your physical stress response totally depends on the context that stress is imposed, within which that stress is imposed. And I think this was kind of the catalyst to really throw the field, to open the way for more interdisciplinary work and to throw the field into a little bit of chaos. And I think chaos is what the field descended into then, because nobody really had a firm definition. The biologists' definition totally clashed with the psychologists' definition, and there wasn't really any bridging mechanism at the time. And, throughout the 70s and the 80s, lots of people came up with various paradigms and conceptual frameworks, but none really seemed to capture enough people's imagination to get momentum behind it. Until in 1988, Sterling and Eyre proposed what they called a model of allostasis. Now, I guess a good way perhaps to characterize homeostasis, or the homeostatic concept of Selye, and allostasis was, homeostasis is trying to maintain critical levels of fundamental systems by being permanent, through permanency or constancy. So in other words, if my homeostatic state goes out of whack, then I will release lots of cortisol, and that will power the remediation of that stress such that I return to homeostatic state. Homeostasis is consistency through permanency. I want one thing, and if I deviate a small bit from that one thing, I get back there straight away. Whereas allostasis actually acknowledged that, well, actually, there's very few aspects of our biological system that are so rigid. There are some things like, maybe pH in the brain, temperature of the brain, some things like that are actually homeostatic, but most of our subsystems and our systems they're much more flexible in how they work. And it's not about holding any one system in this permanent state of optimal functioning, but it's more about relationships and how individual subsystems interact and chop and co-modulate, if you like, so that on a macro scale, everything functions fine. But under the surface, there's this constant interplay and nudging and adapting and compensating for constantly changing states. So a much more fluid, agile, flexible system. And I don't know if this is helpful, but the way I think about it is, if you were trying to develop the most efficient heating system for a really big entity, take Buckingham Palace or the White House or some multi-room, multi-story big building, and you were looking at the most effective way to regulate temperature. Well, the obvious thing is the equivalent of homeostatic principles. It's just, well, you set the thermostat to whatever you want. And then if you drop below that, the furnace kicks in and you increase the temperature again. But from an evolutionary biological perspective, that's actually really sloppy. I mean, what you could do is have very sensitive thermostats percolated throughout the building. And as soon as one of them picks up, you know what? I'm just starting to rise just a fraction. Open a window, open a door, create a draft. Do something locally and small that offsets that very slight rise in temperature. And that, I guess, in a nutshell, is allostasis. It's not about you have this big one fundamental clumsy response, but there's all these multiple types of responses that happen in tandem so that no system is challenged substantially. It's just lots of systems change their outputs very slightly, and that really flexibly solves your problem at minimum cost, at minimum disruption, at minimum threat.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I like that example.
Yeah, and there's actually a very good quote from a US researcher, I think into the heart, called Goldstein, who called it the beautiful paradox of seeming constancy despite continuous change. And I think when you look at it through an evolutionary filter, it makes so much more sense than just this kind of big, blocky, clumsy response of if this, then this. It's like, if this, we have flexible adaptive systems that just change their outputs in coordination, and that nice and smoothly and non-traumatically alleviates the imposed challenge. I mean, where I came into this was thinking about how because we had built so much of our training theory on stress response, that kind of impelled me to go down and look into the actual basis of this. And then, you dig around and you say, well, hang on. The stress theory has changed dramatically since the 1930s, right? Since Selye. And so, okay, there was the theoretical shift. I mean, and all of that is interesting, but does it change what me as a practitioner would do on the ground? Or if I was advising somebody, what does it actually change other than some nice, fluffy conceptual backdrop? Well, one of the main implications of Selye's work was physical stress doesn't really have anything to do with the brain. Physical challenge, physical adaptation, that's it. Straight line. And again, the sports science world is filled with these models, adaptation and supercompensation, and they're depicted as if they're predictable. So first thing is, stress response is not predictable. Stress in rats, it might be, but the nature of your stress response to any imposed challenge will vary dramatically from mine. You might love skydiving. I think it's pretty fair to say that might relax you. It's going to not relax me, and it won't relax most people. The same way, there's a reason that roller coasters last for a minute and a half rather than for 3 hours. It's like a limited stress response. We all like that because we get that release of neuroendorphins and transmitters and neurohormones and neuromodulators, and all of a sudden we feel primed. We're excited. You do that for 3 hours, you have a very different thing. So I think the stress response, it's a baby bear's porridge phenomenon for me. It's like not too much and not too little. But the other main evolution, I think, in the field, and the evolution between the conventional biological stress response and the allostasis perspective, is that Selye and Cannon before him felt that stress was mediated primarily through the adrenals. It was a glandular response. You released, for Cannon, it was adrenaline or norepinephrine. And for Selye, it was more corticosteroid, which is the rodent equivalent of cortisol. So they were if you want to think of it as the primary signal that triggered the stress response. But I guess what's happened, and really only in the past 10 years, is that primary signal isn't actually something that happens mechanically. It is something that happens deep in the brain, in the emotional centers of the brain. And effectively what it is if you think of the emotional centers in a very broad way, you have your shiny new frontal cortex on top that is thinking thoughts. You have your kind of limbic system below, which is just sending up sensations and so on. And it's those emotional centers that are trying to coalesce those and make sense of those. So, and your emotions, you could, in a broad way, you could perceive as they're a mixture of what I'm feeling, what I'm sensing, and what I'm thinking. And our emotional, and sorry, I'm pointing here, and I know I shouldn't. So what is the purpose of our emotions? And I think for me, and not because I thought of it, but from reading the experts that do think about this a lot and more intelligently and more deeply, is your emotions in a sense are a way of us interpreting the threat that's out there, that we're exposed to. So I can think that threat, I can feel that threat, but, most obviously it's a combination of the two. So when I perceive a threat, and that perception might first be driven by some changing sensation, that's registered in the emotional centers of our brain, and it's assigned a weight, a valence, an importance. And that causes a little micro change in the neurochemical environment, and that then percolates down and starts a cascade of neural events, which in turn initiate a cascade of biological events. And all of a sudden what we have is we have a change in chemistry within the brain and within the body. Now, why is that important? Well, if that's the fundamental trigger that initiates our stress response, and we can influence it by thoughts, by feeling, all those things that can influence our emotions, it very much changes, again, coming at from my practical perspective when we talk about physical conditioning, it very much changes how we interpret what good training is or what good training isn't. So again, for example, if I transition back to periodization is all about the prescription, the forecasting in advance of what type of physical, mechanical training will move you from position X to position Y, will move you from this level of conditioning to that level of conditioning. But suppose when I do my training session, I arrive in a stressed condition. And when I say stressed, what I mean is there is some degree of emotional imbalance. As a result, the background chemistry of my brain and of my body is disrupted in some suboptimal fashion. Then the effects of the mechanical training that I overlay on that neurochemical state is going to be completely different than if I train when I'm in a different mood, with a different set of emotions, with a different stress level. And I guess if there is a kind of a big idea coming out of this revamping or updating of stress theory, it's that I think in my world, we have been convincing ourselves for a long time that training is all about the actual physical characteristics of the exercises that you execute. Whereas I don't think that's true. I think it is also totally dependent on the background chemical backdrop upon which you overlay those mechanical stressors.
In terms of training, what are some of the factors you think that go into this backdrop? Do you think there's a way that we can control that or help an athlete get better at emotional regulation so that he can be more predict the physical aspects, or is it more about just being adaptive in your training design?
Well, I think there's potentially a number of lessons, and it'd be wrong of me to suggest that I had the answer, because I think this is really a new and evolving area. But I can tell you what the bits of research that are coming through, maybe the past 3 years, 4 maybe. And what we do see is injury certainly goes up with anxiety. And anxiety, in a sense, is a synonym for, emotional disturbance. injury rates certainly seem to go up. And there's been a number of reviews published in the past couple of years in high-ranking journals in my area, sports medicine. Yeah, so we're actually seeing the hard evidence of this, even though it mightn't be interpreted as a result of the stress response. It's just, hey, look, when people are anxious, they get more injured. Now, again, we haven't nailed down what the mechanisms are, but I guess what I would suggest from looking at this evidence in a different field, in the stress field, is that, well, it's a changing chemical backdrop, and that changing neurochemical backdrop changes everything. Changes everything from how you approach a problem, how you think, the decisions you make, right down to the micro level in terms of how you may coordinate, how you may, when I say coordinate, your co-activation strategies are slightly inappropriate. Your stiffness, how you set stiffness around joints, slightly inappropriate for the context. And all of a sudden, all these small little injury risk factors start to bubble up. And when you look at as I said, the studies that have been published the past couple of years, a pretty clear association between how stressed you are going into the training phase or competition and the amount of injuries you suffer within that competition or training phase.
I guess one of the points that you've tried to make is that we don't seem to be stepping ahead our training periodization. Part of it, I guess, is just easier. I know you're interested in running too. Like I think of when you give a novice runner a marathon training plan, it's just easy to put all the miles on the days and say, here, do this. Whereas to me, it seems like we need to be much more individual, right? Because everybody's individual is going to have different emotional responses and different interpretations of stress. So we can't do one fit for everybody kind of training plans, really, can we?
No, and I think that, first of all, you're absolutely right. And I think that that's the big lie underpinning so much of our training theory. The assumption that if I give you a training session, you will respond in the same way as the next person. And I think it's clear that that's not the case. Now, what isn't so clear is, why is that not the case? So there's a couple of obvious things. There's genetics. So you will have a different genotype to me, and that will in part regulate how you respond to any given stress imposition. But again, it's not just what genes you have, it's also what gene networks are actually switched on or activated. And that is primarily due to prior exposure, a lot of early life influences, and this would be the world of epigenetic change. So what stresses have you been exposed to previously? And as a consequence, what gene networks are now primed and ready to respond to future similar stress impositions in the future? So again, it's not just your genotype, it's what gene networks are primed for response. And again, that's predicated on past experience. So there's two things which we can't really do a lot about on a day-to-day basis. What we can do a lot about on a day-to-day basis, and a lot of theory is consumed with this, is things like nutrition, sleep strategies, all those common sense things. I guess what we could, and I think should, add in as a consequence of the topics we talked about in this conversation, is that there's a huge undervalued role for how do I get the athlete in the right emotional state? What is our plan if the athlete rocks up and they're a bit ragged, or they're not quite where we want them to be for this session? So they're rushed, or they're doing exams in university, or they're fighting with their partner, or whatever it might be. That is going to have, because again, the chemical backdrop upon which you're going to overlay your training stress is changed. It's going to have a completely different effect than if they were in a different state. So what do we do? And one of the things I think we can do is educate the athletes, develop tools where we can And the way I think of it is kind of setting to zero. It's kind of resetting. So rather than I fight my way through traffic, really stressed, straight into my training session, perhaps I come and there's kind of a cooling off period where I remind myself of why I'm here, what's this about, what are my long-term objectives, who do I want to be, how is this going to help me? Those type of things that, again, ground me, refocus me, help clarify exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing. I think education around that, and then allowing athletes the space and perhaps giving them the tools to moderate their stress response prior to training, would be a really cost-effective way of ensuring that we more regularly get optimal training outcomes. Now, what I add in there is that I think that the really great coaches have been doing this for a long time instinctively. I think the really great coaches are the ones that go to the extra lengths to really explain to the athlete, here's what we're doing. Here's how this will help you and why this will help you. Here's how this training now will help you realize your long-term training goals. So I think the great coaches have done that. They've inspired senses of security. They've inspired sense of confidence. They've positively massaged the kind of coaching placebo effect that you can get by getting your ideas out of your head and into the athlete's head. So when the athlete does engage in training, they're that little bit less stressed. They're confident in what they're doing and their capability of doing it. They're sure about how it's going to help them. And there's this more complete buy-in. If you go to perhaps a more inexperienced coach, and you often hear it, don't ask questions, just do it. That to me is not really good coaching. That's more coaching for the military in a sense. And even then I question it. Yeah, I think there's a lot that we can do from an environmental design perspective, from a communication perspective, from building in feedback and, giving the athlete a say in the training that they do and the way you run the training and all of those things that over the long term can really optimize athlete buy-in, optimize confidence, and just start to eat away at all those kind of negative doubts that, if you're a professional athlete, you have all kind of doubts and insecurities and is my funding going to run out? Is the coach going to pick me? You have lots and lots of stuff going on. You don't want more stress. You want less stress. You want all of your energy to go into moving you forward positively when you train. You don't want to consume it through worry and anxiety and insecurity. And I don't know what the coach is doing. I'm not sure where my place is here. I really don't like this environment. I really don't get why we're doing this. And that type of thing I would think is kind of kryptonite for athlete development.
Yeah, no, I think those are great points. And I often, when I give talks on pressure, choking under pressure, people ask, what do teams do to make athletes better able to handle it? And from a large part of what I've seen, like when you look at a lot of the soccer academies or the youth, they don't. They just put the people through the ringer and find out who comes out the other end. But they really don't give them any tools to help them deal with it. They just see who can. You're right, like the military approach, we'll put you through hell, and if you survive the other end, then it means you're in the team, or instead of trying to give people skills and to do this. So I think that's a really good point.
And I think you're totally right. I think what we do is, again, it's kind of a survivorship bias. We think what we do works because somebody wins the Olympic gold medal and sets the gold record, and sets the world record. So we're inclined to look at survivors and think, well, their coach didn't do this with them. But you have to look at the graveyard of evidence. You have to look at the casualties. You have to look at the highly talented people who didn't make it. And you think, well, why couldn't we convert more people? And again, if just some research has come into my mind that anxious athletes tend to have more injuries. Yes. When I say anxious now, I don't mean just anxiety. I've already mentioned transitioning anxiety or high stress states. But just those people who, for whatever reason, be it genetic or early life, are more prone to anxiety, as a personality type factor, tend to get more injured. And all the overuse syndromes in terms of not just physical injury, but things like burnout, overtraining syndrome, underperformance, and so on.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting area. There's, I could think of there's lots of mechanisms you could see that having an effect. Anxiety is distracting. If you have distracting thoughts, you're not going to pay attention on the field. But on the other hand, you can be over focused on yourself, which is bad too. Worrying about being injured is the best way to get injured. I think that's a really interesting area to explore.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that all of those emotions have a chemical consequence. And that chemical consequence, it's not just isolated to that small part of the, emotional brain. A change in chemistry there initiates a cascade of changes. And all of a sudden, you're moving from what might be I guess we could call a maybe neutral or ready state to, okay, now I'm starting to get a little more anxious because I'm kicking out more cortisol or whatever it might be. And again, I think that high sports performance or elite sports performances and the elite sporting life, if you like, just in terms of the training life, the stress of worrying about the big event, the big race, the injury, it's quite a stressful, life, because there's lots of factors typically outside the athlete's control. And I think our role as, educators, coaches, trainers, is in part to design that environment, to design communication systems to really help the athlete through that, to mitigate all those stresses. Again, you have to be able to handle stress, but ideally what we want to do is prepare people by giving them gradually progressive stress impositions, not ones that are, in a non-organized way, just bombarding the athlete from everyday external life, or bombarding the athlete because they just don't have the coping skills. A very standard thing to see in elite sport is today's a rest day. So today's the day when I recharge. But actually, if I look at what you're going to do, you're going to be busier today than you are in your training days. Yeah, well, it's the only day I have to pay my bills and to get to the shops and to buy this stuff and to walk the dog and to visit my grandmother. And all of a sudden, most people's rest days tend to be high stress days where you've, vastly overcommitted yourself and now you're chasing your tail, and getting back to training is nearly a relaxation. So I think there's a lot of things we could do there. What I'd also say is that I think that some coaches historically have been really good at this, not because they knew any science but just because they were empathetic and, I don't know, maybe emotionally intelligent might be a phrase, but designed programs where they ensured athlete buy-in and they gave athlete a sense of self-determination and self-control. So they gave the athlete degrees of freedom to work within. And now I think that, and I'm thinking particularly of a couple of coaches in Altus in Arizona, led by Dan Paff, who I know issue kind of a feedback forms, for example, to athletes. Now you go back a few years, or still in most parts of the world, and why the hell would you do that? I say the athlete does, but again, I think that's a very fragile, a very unidimensional approach to coaching. I think that you don't want to be the dictator, you want to be the facilitator. You don't want to, and I guess it's the coach seeing himself or herself as an enabler rather than that person that controls and designs and drives everything. Like that, the athlete is just the body, but the coach is the brain. I think that type of approach needs to go. Mm-hmm. And I think the approach of how can I help you evolve, develop? How can I nurture? How can I give you the tools gradually so you can better handle the situations and the stressors that you're subjected to.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really great. And another thing I like about this breaks down kind of this hard separation between physiology and psychology. I never liked that. Like when people ask, does that affect physiological or psychological? Well, all psychological things are physiological, right? They're made by neurochemical, right? So I don't like that. Obviously there's differences we can classify, but it's nice to see, there's more of an interaction here in this area.
I'm really glad you brought that up because you've reminded me of a couple of things. So here's one of my favorite experiments. So there's a well-known researcher in a certain field in the States called John Gottman. Now he looks at relationships. And one of the things he does is he brings couples into kind of hermetically sealed environments and really just looks at them and takes measurements. And he's been doing this for, 40, 50 years. But one of his experiments really struck me. So you get a couple in and you introduce one of the partners, you give them a histamine reaction. Essentially, you introduce, like you sting them with a nettle for all effects, a little purely chemical challenge that induces a rash on their forearm. Now, if that couple are getting on well, all is good in their stay at his lab, then that rash goes away after a day. If they're arguing, that rash goes away on average over 3 days. And, when you think about something like that, it seems so removed from anything to do with your emotions. But again, it's just your emotions are what is really signaling you to here's the state of readiness you need to be in. And that state of readiness isn't optimal for healing. So I just found that amazing. And there's a few findings like that which are just really eye-opening, where you can just see that kind of proposed separation that we've all had. You're a psychologist, say, by training. I'm a muscles guy. Yeah, it's an artificial separation. And I think to be really good at what we do, we need to be aware of that.
Yeah, definitely. I have one final question for you. Where do you think we need to go next in terms of advancing stress-related training and periodization?
So this hasn't been a short-term thing. I guess I have been a little bit of a periodization pervert, if there is such a thing, for the past, 17, 18 years. And that's really curiosity into that. First of all, with periodization, all of us in the Western world, or pretty much all of us, me included, just bought into the Soviet model. And I don't know if you're aware of the periodization literature, but it's absolutely dominated by ex-Soviets. And we all looked up to them because of the Soviet sports system, yada, 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 and the proposed science behind it. But again, you scratch beneath the surface and it just all falls apart. And there wasn't really any science behind it. What there was a lot of dogma and a lot of, similar to the cellular thing, you have these historical foundations that have since deteriorated, but we continue to build layers and layers and more stories on top of these now obliterated foundations. And I think training theory is very much like that. And, if we really go back to the prior assumptions, a lot of the time they just fall apart. And I think that's just a reflection. It's not a reflection on anyone. It's just a reflection of we're relatively new. We are new sciences. We're not that well established. And I think we're in a state of that kind of early state of a lot of flux and a lot of questing around. And I think that part of the explosion that's happening at the moment in the sports sciences, yes, part of it is driven by enhanced technology and computing capabilities, but part of it is just that what we're building on was so poor in a lot of cases. Now, I'm saying sports science there, I'm not saying coaching. There's been a lot of really fantastic coaches historically who did more than they should have been able to with the knowledge base that they had. There's so much just good intuition and compassion and empathy and common sense. But a lot of those great coaches were wrong about a lot of things, and I guess I see kind of our role as as moving things forward, not in a way that's disrespectful of the past, but a way that kind of builds on the good things in the past and replaces it with better insight.
Yeah, definitely can sympathize. I know some things in my area that we all admit are no longer valid, but you find them in textbooks and keep popping up. It's hard to get rid of them. They were so influential. So that was great. Thank you for taking some time to talk with me, John.
My pleasure. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks again for the great discussion, John. This quote-unquote brain guy definitely has a lot to think about after talking to you, the quote-unquote muscles guy. You can learn more about John from the links in the show notes and follow him on Twitter at SimplySportsSci. Coming soon on the Perception in Action podcast, skill acquisition as a manifold of solutions. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.